I'm Julian Cross, and if invisibility were a family sport, I'd have a trophy case. I grew up as the other son, the one you mention with a sigh while the good china comes out for my older brother Lucas. He's the kind of man my parents, Margaret and Thomas, believe the world was made for. Rich, sleek, and mean in ways that pass as ambition at country clubs. By the time I was 7, I'd figured out the rules. Lucas got the bay window room and a BMW at 16. I got the closet by the water heater and lectures about earning your share. When I got into Stanford, my mother skimmed the letter and asked if I'd remembered to send Lucas congratulations for making Princeton's dean's list. Love in our house wasn't unconditional. It was indexed to a portfolio. The day I understood how far it went was the day Lucas stole my girlfriend. Her name was Claire. I'd been pricing rings. Lucas took her to a gala, my parents called it, an upgrade, and my father told me the strong survive while the weak get left behind. I packed a duffel that night and left, promising myself I'd never beg for a seat at that table again. I built a life. I started a consulting business, slept on a futon, learned how to stretch a grocery dollar until it squeaked. When you remove, the chorus telling you you're small, your voice gets louder. Clients found me. A team coalesced, the company grew, and then, in the middle of all that grind, I met Elena, an elementary school teacher with a Civic that rattled in the winter, and a laugh that made my chest feel like it had sky in it. She didn't care about my family, my last name, or the shadow of my brother's success. She cared that I listened. We married in her parents' backyard in borrowed string lights and garden roses. I felt seen for the first time in my life. A year later, Elena was pregnant. 8 weeks. We cried over ultrasound static like it was the moon landing, and then a ridiculous thought snuck in. Maybe this would soften my parents. Maybe a grandchild could crack the marble. I knew better. But hope is a stubborn thing. We drove to the Cross House, the white columns, the oil paintings that looked like polite accidents. Lucas was there, radiating ownership from my father's old leather chair. My mother air-kissed Elena like she'd found a stain on a tuxedo. Dad poured a wine Elena couldn't stomach and bragged about Lucas's Singapore deal. I tried not to drown in old riptides. When the appetizers cleared, I squeezed Elena's hand and stood. "We have news?" I said. My voice sounded steadier than my pulse. "We're expecting." Stillness, then impact. My father slammed his glass hard enough to bleed wine across the cloth. "No," he said. "The first grandchild must be Lucas's." He pointed like he was naming an heir apparent, and I was a staffer who'd forgotten his badge. And then, my mother stepped forward and hit Elena's stomach. Everything stuttered. Elena folded with a sound I'll never forget. I caught her before she hit the floor, the shock on her face turning to pain and then terror. My mother's voice. A blade. Of ice. Get rid of it. That child has no place in this family. I saw red. Not metaphor. Edges of vision. Actual red. Every feral part of me wanted to launch across the table. But Elena's fingers dug into my arm. "Julian," she gasped. "The baby." So I gathered her up and walked. My father threatened to cut me off. My mother laughed, certain I'd crawl back. I told them what I should have said years ago. "Keep your money. I'm keeping my soul." The drive to the hospital was a tunnel of red lights and the sound of Elena's breath hitching. I repeated lies I wanted to be true. "You're okay. The baby's okay." And replayed a childhood of smaller slaps. The bike that became Lucas's. The college letters eclipsed by his report cards. The way love was rationed like a scarce commodity the rich deserved more of. The nurses took Elena the second we stumbled in. I paced the waiting room like a caged thing. Then the doors opened and my father walked in with his CEO stride, asking for updates like he was calling a quarterly meeting. I told him to try sincerity somewhere else. My mother followed, tears smudged, apology-free. She was sorry I'd had to see that. Not that she'd done it. Not that the person she hit was carrying my child. "I was protecting the family legacy," she said. Lucas will provide the proper heirs. I was preparing to choose between a scene and a felony when the doors opened again and my grandfather walked in. Richard Cross is 83 and moves like gravity makes an exception for him. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. My father went white. My mother stepped back like he'd slapped her with nothing but his name. "I heard," he said simply, cane tapping once against the tile, "and I will not allow this." My mother tried to set the narrative, the way she always does. Misunderstanding, emotions ran high. Grandfather cut a glance so cold you could skate on it. "Margaret, you will not speak unless I ask you to." He had already gotten a call from a neighbor with eyes like a hawk and an enthusiasm for curtains, who watched the dinner unfold through the picture window. Fax had arrived before we did. Then Tara walked in, Lucas's long-term ex, hands tight around a purse, courage in her jaw. Grandfather had called her. "Tell them," he said. She did. About how Lucas bragged that taking Claire from me would be fun, about how my parents praised him for upgrading, about a private investigator hired to dig up dirt on Elena when marriage made sabotage harder. And when dirt didn't exist, how more direct approaches were discussed. "Margaret," Grandfather asked softly, "is this true?" Cornered animals make terrible choices. My mother took the dramatic route. "We were protecting the family," she said. "Lucas is worthy of the Cross name. Julian is—" She searched for a word and found the one she'd raised me under. "A disappointment." The sliding doors opened again. Elena stood there, pale and steady, a nurse at her elbow. "I heard everything," she said, eyes on my mother. "I don't need your approval. But my child deserves protection from people like you. I want to press charges." Silence cracked. A social worker appeared like the hospital had pressed a red button under the desk. "Assault on a pregnant woman is a criminal matter," she said, clipboard ready. My father tried to pivot, private family business, misunderstandings, but the word intentional left my mouth and the room shifted. Grandfather watched my father like a judge who has already read every page. "What did you expect of your younger son?" he asked. My father's answer floated out like a confession he'd rehearsed in private. Julian was never supposed to. He couldn't say it until Grandfather made him. To reproduce. There it was. The family thesis statement. My mother looked satisfied with it. My father looked relieved to be finished hiding. I felt something inside me go still. Something that had been begging all my life finally sat down and shut the door. Lucas arrived late, sniffed the wind, and slid away from the blast radius like a pro. "Dad," he said, "you're on your own with the felonies. Sharks don't share when there's blood in the water." Grandfather tapped his cane once. "Thomas," he said, "you are no longer my son." It was like watching a skyscraper lose power floor by floor. My father sagged into a plastic chair, eyes glassy. Grandfather turned to me with something like sorrow and resolve braided together. "Julian," he said, "from this day forward you are my heir. I didn't want their blood money. I still don't." But in that moment, the word didn't mean cash to me. It meant a different definition of our name. It meant someone finally saying out loud that worth and wealth are not synonyms. Elena filed for a restraining order. The social worker helped. Security escorted my parents out, my mother alternating between outrage and tears, my father leaking in quiet shock. Lucas evaporated. Elena's parents arrived, a principal and a kindergarten teacher with steel in their spines, and wrapped us in a different kind of family, the kind that shows up without a ledger. We went home at 2 a.m. with doctor's orders to avoid stress. Ridiculous advice that also felt like permission to lock the door on the mansion I'd been banished from years ago. Grandfather sat in our living room like he'd been there forever. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I mistook favoritism for normal friction. I should have stepped in sooner. Tara came too, and when I asked her why she'd risked it, she said she was tired of being complicit, that she'd watched Lucas hurt everyone, and she was done being furniture in his stories. 7 quiet months followed. The restraining order worked like a medieval moat. Lucas disappeared to wherever men like him go to rebrand. Elena's belly grew round and gorgeous. We argued about names and paint colors and bought a crib that looked like a small ship. Grandfather set up an education. Trust after asking permission and came to every appointment like a sentinel in a good suit. Labor came like a storm at 4 a.m. Elena coached me through my own breathing while doing the impossible. 16 hours later, she made a sound like victory, and the doctor said, "One more push." Then our daughter arrived with a furious cry that reset my understanding of joy. I cut the cord with shaking hands. They wrapped her in a blanket printed with tiny blue footsteps and placed her in my arms. She stopped crying like she recognized my heartbeat from the other side of the wall. "Hi," I whispered, useless and undone. "I'm your dad." We named her Sophia. Grandfather held her like she was a treaty, tears running into the lines time had written on his face. Elena's parents took turns. The nurse smiled, and I realized nobody in that room cared what a balance sheet said. It occurred to me that my parents could never steal this moment, not with money, not with threats. No,